Declassified. September 14, 1944. The morning mist clung to the scarred hillsides of eastern France like a funeral shroud, carrying with it the acrid stench of cordite and the metallic tang of blood that had soaked into the churned earth for weeks. Private First Class Tommy Kowalski pressed his face against the cold stone of the abandoned farmhouse cellar, feeling the vibrations of another German artillery barrage shake dust from the ceiling beams above his head. The 88mm shells whistled overhead with their distinctive banshee wail before exploding in thunderous crescendos that made his teeth rattle and his ears ring despite the cotton wadding he'd stuffed into them days ago. Through a crack in the foundation wall, Tommy could see the German gun emplacements that had turned this once peaceful valley into a killing field. 5 massive artillery pieces, positioned with mathematical precision on the opposite ridge, dominated the entire approach to the village of Morhange. The Wehrmacht had transformed the hilltop into an impregnable fortress, with interconnected trenches, concrete bunkers, and fields of fire that covered every possible avenue of attack. The guns themselves were the feared German 15cm SFH-18 howitzers, each capable of hurling a 95-pound high-explosive shell over 9 miles with devastating accuracy. For 3 weeks, the American forces had been pinned down in this valley, unable to advance or retreat. The German artillery commanded such a perfect view of the terrain that any movement during daylight hours meant certain death. At night, the enemy illuminated the approaches with flares and searchlights, turning the darkness into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The 357th Infantry Regiment had lost over 200 men in failed attempts to silence those guns, including 2 entire platoons that had been caught in the open during a pre-dawn assault that had gone horribly wrong. The mathematical precision of their predicament was as stark as it was terrifying. The German artillery could deliver concentrated fire on any point in the valley within 90 seconds of initial spotting. Their observers, positioned in the church bell tower of Morhange, had unobstructed sight lines for miles in every direction. The Americans were trapped in a box canyon of death, with steep ridgelines on 3 sides and the German guns commanding the only way out. Supply drops came only at night, and medical evacuations were nearly impossible. Men were dying not just from enemy fire, but from infected wounds that festered in the damp, unsanitary conditions of their improvised bunkers. What made the situation even more desperate was the intelligence reports that kept flowing in from reconnaissance units. A full German armored division was massing just 10 miles to the east, preparing for a counteroffensive that would roll right through this valley. If those artillery pieces weren't silenced within the next 48 hours, 3,000 American soldiers would be caught between the guns on the ridge and advancing panzer tanks with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple: 5 German guns held the lives of 3,000 American soldiers in their steel hands. But as Tommy Kowalski watched those gun crews through his improvised periscope, fashioned from a broken mirror and a bent piece of metal tubing, his mind wasn't focused on the hopelessness of their situation. Instead, he was studying the terrain with the trained eye of someone who had spent his entire adult life underground. Because while everyone else saw insurmountable obstacles, Tommy saw something different entirely. He saw rock formations, soil composition, and drainage patterns. He saw the subtle signs that most people missed, the geological fingerprints that told a story older than the war itself. The other soldiers had given up hope. Colonel Matthews had sent 3 separate requests for air support, only to be told that the German positions were too well protected by anti-aircraft guns to risk precious bombers. Artillery barrages from the American side had proven useless against the German bunkers, which were constructed with 6 feet of reinforced concrete and expertly positioned to deflect incoming fire. Direct assault had been tried and failed with catastrophic losses. Every conventional military solution had been attempted and found wanting. Yet Tommy continued to watch and calculate, his coal-stained fingers tracing patterns in the dirt of the cellar floor. He was remembering another time, another place, when he had faced what seemed like an impossible problem deep beneath the earth in the anthracite mines of Pennsylvania. He was remembering a technique so old and so simple that it had been forgotten by most miners, relegated to the dusty pages of 19th-century mining manuals and the fading memories of old-timers who had learned their trade before modern equipment changed everything. How could one man, armed with nothing more than his understanding of geology and some improvised tools, accomplish what 3 weeks of conventional military might had failed to achieve. How could a coal miner from Scranton, Pennsylvania, succeed where trained artillery observers, experienced infantry officers, and seasoned combat engineers had all failed? The answer lay not in superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but in understanding something far more fundamental about the earth itself, something that would turn those 5 seemingly invincible German guns into monuments to the folly of underestimating American ingenuity. The autumn of 1944 had been a season of grinding warfare across the European theater, where every mile gained came at a price measured in hundreds of lives. The Allied advance following the Normandy landings had bogged down into a series of brutal attritional battles as German forces fought desperately to defend every village, every hill, every river crossing. From the Bocage country of northwestern France to the industrial cities of the Ruhr Valley, American, British, and Canadian forces found themselves facing an enemy that grew more dangerous as it retreated toward its homeland. The broader strategic situation painted a picture of inevitable Allied victory, but at a cost that was becoming almost unbearable. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, having broken the back of Army Group Center in Operation Bagration during the summer. British and Canadian forces were grinding their way through the Netherlands in a series of costly river crossings. American forces under Patton had liberated most of eastern France, but each kilometer came harder than the last as German resistance stiffened with every step closer to the Reich. It was against this backdrop of global warfare that Tommy Kowalski had made his decision to enlist, though his path to the battlefield had been far from straightforward. Born in 1920 in the hardscrabble mining town of Carbondale, Pennsylvania, Tommy had known from childhood that his future lay in the dark tunnels beneath the earth. His father, Stefan Kowalski, had emigrated from the mining regions of Silesia in 1905, carrying with him generations of underground knowledge that had been passed down through Polish mining families for centuries. The Kowalski family had worked the same coal seam for nearly 4 decades, and Tommy had been going down into the mines with his father since he was 12 years old, learning the ancient art of reading rock formations, understanding how water moved through limestone, and recognizing the subtle signs that warned of cave-ins, gas pockets, or underground streams. By the time he was 18, Tommy could navigate the labyrinthine tunnel systems of the Delaware and Hudson mine complex blindfolded, and his reputation for finding the richest coal veins had made him one of the most sought-after miners in the entire Lackawanna Valley. The mining life had shaped Tommy's character in ways that would prove crucial on distant battlefields. Underground work demanded absolute precision, infinite patience, and the ability to solve complex 3-dimensional problems with limited resources. A mistake in the mines didn't just mean lost productivity, it meant death for yourself and your crew. Every decision had to be calculated not just for immediate results, but for consequences that might not manifest for days or weeks. The underground environment was unforgiving, demanding both physical courage and intellectual rigor in equal measure. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Tommy had been torn between his sense of patriotic duty and his responsibility to his family. The mines were considered essential war production, and miners were generally exempt from military service. Coal powered the steel mills that produced the ships, tanks, and weapons that would win the war. Tommy's expertise made him particularly valuable, as he had developed innovative techniques for extracting coal from seemingly exhausted seams, methods that had increased productivity by nearly 30% in the sections where he worked. But as the war dragged on and casualty reports filled the newspapers, Tommy found it increasingly difficult to justify staying safe underground while men his age were dying on beaches in the Pacific and in the hedgerows of France. The decision finally came in March 1944, when he learned that his childhood friend Mike Kowalski, no relation, despite the shared surname, had been killed at Anzio. That night, Tommy walked into the Army recruitment office in Scranton and enlisted as a private in the infantry, despite the recruiting sergeant's repeated attempts to steer him toward the Corps of Engineers, where his mining background would be considered invaluable. Basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, had been a revelation for Tommy in ways both positive and challenging. The physical demands were actually less than what he had endured in the mines, where 12-hour shifts in cramped, poorly ventilated tunnels had built the kind of wiry strength and endurance that drill sergeants could only admire. But the military's emphasis on conformity and unquestioning obedience chafed against Tommy's independent nature, developed through years of making split-second decisions in life-or-death situations underground. His breakthrough moment came during a combat engineering exercise in the Georgia pine forests, when his company was tasked with clearing a path through a heavily defended position. While other recruits focused on frontal assault tactics, Tommy studied the terrain and noticed a dry creek bed that ran behind the enemy positions. Working through the night with nothing but an entrenching tool and his knowledge of soil composition, he excavated a tunnel system that allowed his entire squad to emerge behind the mock enemy positions, winning the exercise without firing a shot. The training officer who witnessed this display was Captain James Morrison, a West Point graduate who had studied military history and recognized genius when he saw it. Morrison took Tommy under his wing, encouraging his unorthodox thinking while teaching him how to work within military command structures. It was Morrison who arranged for Tommy to attend specialized combat engineering courses, where his mining background was finally recognized as the strategic asset it truly was. The deployment to France in August 1944 had been Tommy's first taste of actual combat, and the reality of warfare had proven far more chaotic and terrifying than anything he had experienced in the structured environment of training. The sounds, smells, and constant threat of death created a sensory overload that took weeks to process and adapt to. The first time he experienced artillery fire, the noise and concussion reminded him eerily of controlled demolitions in the mines, but with the crucial difference that someone was actively trying to kill him. His first weeks in combat had been spent with a reconnaissance unit, using his underground expertise to map German tunnel systems and defensive positions. The work was dangerous but suited to his skills, requiring him to crawl through drainage culverts, abandoned cellars, and natural cave systems to gather intelligence on enemy positions. It was during these missions that he began to understand how European geology differed from the Pennsylvania coal regions he knew so intimately, and how these differences might be exploited for military advantage. The assignment to the 357th Infantry Regiment had come after his original unit was decimated during the fighting around Metz. Tommy found himself attached to a standard rifle company, where his specialized knowledge seemed irrelevant to the daily grind of infantry warfare. For the first time since enlisting, he began to question whether his decision to join the regular infantry, rather than the engineers, had been a mistake. That doubt would persist until a foggy September morning when he would finally understand why fate had placed him in this particular valley, at this particular time, facing this particular problem that only he possessed the knowledge and skills to solve. The German positions on the ridge above Morringe had been constructed with the methodical thoroughness that characterized Wehrmacht defensive engineering throughout the war. The 5 artillery pieces were positioned in concrete-reinforced emplacements that had been blasted directly into the solid limestone bedrock of the ridge, creating bunkers that could withstand direct hits from 155 mm howitzers without suffering significant damage. Each gun position was connected to the others by a complex network of communication trenches and underground tunnels that allowed crews and ammunition to move between positions without exposure to counter-battery fire. The German engineers had chosen their position with careful attention to both tactical and geological considerations. The ridge commanded a perfect field of fire across the entire valley, with observation posts positioned to provide overlapping coverage of all possible approach routes. The limestone bedrock provided a stable foundation for the heavy guns while also offering natural protection against both direct fire and underground assault. Previous reconnaissance missions had confirmed that the Germans had even installed steel-reinforced concrete barriers in the natural cave systems beneath the ridge, preventing any possibility of infiltration from below. What made the position particularly formidable was the way the German defenders had integrated natural terrain features with their artificial fortifications. The steep slopes of the ridge were honeycombed with machine gun nests and mortar positions, creating a layered defense system that could engage attackers at multiple ranges. The approaches to the ridge were covered by pre-registered artillery targets, meaning that German forward observers could call down devastating fire on any attacking force within minutes of initial contact. The American attempts to neutralize these positions had followed predictable patterns, each failing for reasons that became apparent only after significant losses had been sustained. The first assault, launched on August 28, had attempted a direct frontal attack with 2 companies of infantry supported by tank destroyers. The attack had been spotted by German observers while still over a mile from the objective, and the advancing Americans had walked into a carefully orchestrated killing field of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire. 73 men had been killed or wounded in less than 20 minutes, with the survivors forced to retreat under covering smoke. The second attempt had tried to use darkness and surprise to approach the German positions from the north, where a ravine seemed to offer concealed movement to within assault range of the ridge. But the Germans had anticipated this possibility and had prepared the ravine as a kill zone, with machine gun positions on both flanks and mortar crews with pre-plotted fire missions covering every meter of the approach. 42 more Americans had died in that ravine, their bodies still lying where they had fallen because recovery missions had proven impossible under the German guns. The most recent failure had been an elaborate artillery preparation followed by a coordinated assault from multiple directions, designed to overwhelm the German defenders through sheer weight of firepower and numbers. For 6 hours, American guns had pounded the ridge positions with over 1,500 rounds of high-explosive shells, creating a barrage that could be heard for miles and that filled the valley with smoke and dust. When the infantry finally advanced, confident that nothing could have survived such devastation, they discovered that the German guns were not only intact but ready for immediate action. The concrete bunkers had absorbed the punishment without significant damage, and the German crews had simply waited in their underground shelters for the barrage to end. What particularly frustrated the American commanders was their inability to understand how the German positions had been constructed with such apparent invulnerability. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed the gun emplacements clearly, but failed to reveal the extent of the underground tunnel system that connected them. Ground-based observation posts could identify the approximate positions of individual guns, but could not determine the location of ammunition storage areas, command posts, or crew quarters that would need to be neutralized for any assault to succeed. Tommy had been studying these same photographs and observation reports with the focused intensity that he had once brought to geological surveys in the Pennsylvania coal fields. But where military intelligence officers saw defensive positions and fields of fire, Tommy saw something entirely different. He saw a limestone ridge that had been formed over millions of years by the interaction of underground water and soluble bedrock. He saw the telltale signs of karst topography, with its characteristic sinkholes, underground streams, and complex cave systems that could extend for miles beneath the surface. More importantly, Tommy recognized the geological signature of a region where underground water had carved extensive tunnel systems through the limestone, creating natural pathways that the German engineers might not even know existed. The ridge's steep faces and flat top were classic indicators of a limestone formation that had been undercut by centuries of water erosion, leaving behind a network of caves and passages that could potentially be accessed from the valley floor. The breakthrough moment came when Tommy noticed something that everyone else had missed: a small spring emerging from the base of the ridge, approximately 800 meters south of the main German positions. To the casual observer, it was simply a source of fresh water that had been useful for local farmers before the war. But to Tommy's trained eye, it was a geological roadmap that told the story of the entire underground system. The spring's location, flow rate, and mineral content indicated that it was fed by underground streams that flowed directly beneath the German artillery positions. Tommy's mining experience had taught him that limestone cave systems follow predictable patterns based on water flow and geological structure. If he could trace the underground stream that fed that spring, he could potentially access a network of natural tunnels that would allow him to approach the German positions from below, bypassing all their surface defenses entirely. More intriguingly, his knowledge of mining demolition suggested that the right explosive charges, placed at precisely the correct points in the underground system, could destabilize the entire ridge structure and bring down the German gun emplacements through controlled geological collapse. When Tommy first approached his company commander with this idea, Captain Rodriguez had listened with polite skepticism before explaining gently that the army had mining engineers and demolitions experts who had already considered and rejected underground approaches to the German positions. The limestone was too solid, the cave systems too unpredictable, and the risk of cave-ins too great to justify the attempt. Besides, even if Tommy could somehow reach the area beneath the German guns, he would need hundreds of pounds of explosives to have any meaningful effect on positions that had already survived massive artillery bombardments. But Tommy persisted, drawing crude diagrams in the dirt to illustrate his understanding of the underground geology and explaining how his proposed technique differed from conventional mining demolitions. He wasn't talking about using brute force to blast through solid rock, but rather about understanding and exploiting the natural stress points in the limestone formation. The German engineers had actually made themselves vulnerable by digging their bunkers directly into the bedrock, because they had unknowingly compromised the structural integrity of the entire ridge system. The technique Tommy proposed was based on a mining method called room and pillar collapse that had been used in Pennsylvania coal mines since the 19th century. By removing carefully selected support pillars in the right sequence, miners could cause controlled collapses of vast underground areas using relatively small amounts of explosive. The key was understanding the geological stress patterns and identifying the critical points where minimal intervention could trigger maximum structural failure. As Tommy continued to study the German positions and the underlying geology, he began to develop a detailed plan that would require him to access the underground stream system, map the natural cave network, identify the optimal points for explosive placement, and execute a precisely timed sequence of demolitions that would cause the collapse of the entire ridge section containing the German artillery. It was an audacious plan that violated every principle of conventional military engineering, but it was also the only approach that had any realistic chance of succeeding where everything else had failed. The innovation that Tommy proposed was rooted in principles of geology and mining engineering that were centuries old, but its application to military problems represented a completely original synthesis of knowledge and technique. Traditional military demolitions focused on using massive amounts of explosive to destroy targets through direct force, but Tommy's approach was based on understanding and exploiting the natural structural weaknesses that existed in all geological formations. The first component of his technique involved what miners called geological reading, the ability to interpret rock formations and understand how stress forces moved through underground structures. Tommy had spent years developing this skill in the Pennsylvania coal mines, where a miner's ability to predict cave-ins, gas pockets, and water infiltration often meant the difference between life and death for an entire crew. The technique required understanding how different types of rock responded to stress, how water movement affected structural stability, and how the removal of support material in one area could trigger failures in seemingly unrelated locations. Limestone formations were particularly susceptible to this type of manipulation because of their solubility and the way underground water carved complex tunnel systems through the rock over geological time. The German ridge was a textbook example of karst topography, where centuries of water erosion had created an extensive network of caves and passages that followed predictable patterns based on the underlying rock structure. Tommy's mining experience had taught him to recognize these patterns and understand how they could be exploited for controlled demolition purposes. The second component involved a technique called progressive failure, where small explosive charges were used to trigger cascading structural collapses that achieved far greater destruction than the explosives themselves could have produced. This method had been developed in coal mining operations where miners needed to bring down large sections of overburdened rock using minimal amounts of black powder, both for economic reasons and to avoid destabilizing adjacent mine workings. The key to progressive failure was understanding the sequence in which support structures needed to be removed to trigger maximum collapse. In a limestone ridge, this meant identifying the natural pillars and arches that supported the overlying rock mass, then determining the correct order for their removal. Remove them in the wrong sequence, and the explosions would simply create localized damage without affecting the overall structure. Remove them in the right sequence, and the entire formation would collapse under its own weight. Tommy had identified 7 critical points in the cave system beneath the German positions where relatively small charges could be placed to maximum effect. The first 3 charges would remove natural limestone pillars that supported the eastern end of the ridge, creating initial stress fractures that would propagate through the rock formation. The 4th and 5th charges would target a natural arch formation that provided crucial structural support for the central section where 3 of the German guns were positioned. The final 2 charges would complete the failure sequence by removing the remaining support for the western gun positions. The third component of Tommy's technique involved precise timing of the explosive sequence. Unlike conventional demolitions where all charges were detonated simultaneously, progressive failure required carefully calculated delays between each explosion to allow stress waves to propagate through the rock and create the optimal conditions for each subsequent charge. Tommy had calculated that the entire sequence would need to unfold over approximately 10 minutes, with specific delay intervals based on his understanding of how shock waves move through limestone formations. The materials required for this operation were surprisingly modest compared to conventional military demolitions. Tommy would need approximately 40 pounds of TNT, divided into 7 separate charges of varying sizes. More importantly, he would need the specialized knowledge to place these charges at exactly the right locations and detonate them in precisely the correct sequence. No amount of explosive could compensate for improper placement or timing, while the right technique could achieve devastating results with minimal material. The most challenging aspect of the operation would be accessing the underground cave system and navigating to the correct positions for charge placement. This would require Tommy to enter the spring at the base of the ridge and follow the underground stream system through passages that might be flooded, partially collapsed, or too narrow for safe passage. His mining experience had prepared him for this kind of underground navigation, but the additional challenge of carrying explosives through unpredictable cave systems while under potential enemy observation added layers of complexity and danger. Tommy had spent weeks secretly testing components of his technique using small charges in abandoned mine shafts near the American positions. These tests had confirmed his theoretical calculations and demonstrated that progressive failure could indeed be achieved with minimal explosive material when properly applied. Each test had refined his understanding of timing intervals and charge placement, building his confidence that the technique could be scaled up for the assault on the German ridge. The final element of Tommy's innovation was perhaps the most crucial, his understanding of how to conceal the operation from German observers until the moment of execution. The enemy positions commanded excellent observation of the valley floor, but their attention was focused on potential surface approaches to their fortifications. The underground stream system offered a completely hidden avenue of approach that would allow Tommy to position his charges without detection. The psychological impact of this type of attack was another factor that Tommy had considered carefully. German defenders were prepared for conventional artillery bombardments, infantry assaults, and even air attacks, but they would be completely unprepared for their positions to literally collapse beneath them. The sudden and unexpected nature of geological failure would create confusion and panic that would multiply the tactical effects of the structural damage. When Captain Rodriguez finally agreed to allow Tommy to present his plan to the battalion commander, it was largely because conventional options had been exhausted and the strategic situation was becoming desperate. The German armored division was now confirmed to be less than 24 hours away from launching its counteroffensive, and the American forces in the valley faced annihilation if the artillery positions could not be neutralized. In the face of such dire circumstances, even an unconventional plan proposed by a coal miner began to seem worth considering. October 2, 1944. The pre-dawn darkness hung over the valley like a heavy blanket, broken only by the occasional flash of German flares that turned the landscape into a stark tableau of black shadows and harsh white light. Tommy Kowalski moved through the shattered remains of what had once been a prosperous farming village, carrying his improvised demolition kit in a waterproof canvas bag that he had sewn together from salvaged tent material. The air temperature had dropped to just above freezing during the night, and his breath formed small clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly in the damp air. The German artillery had been unusually quiet since midnight, which intelligence reports suggested meant that the crews were preparing for the massive barrage that would precede their armored counteroffensive. German doctrine called for methodical preparation of the battlefield with concentrated artillery fire designed to suppress American defensive positions and create clear lanes of advance for the panzer formations that were even now moving into assault positions less than 10 miles away. Tommy had studied the approaches to the spring for 3 days, memorizing every piece of cover, every shell crater, and every line of sight from the German observation posts. The route he had chosen required him to crawl through a drainage ditch that had been carved by autumn rains, keeping him below the sight lines of enemy observers while providing a relatively direct path to the base of the ridge. The journey would take approximately 45 minutes of careful movement, with several stop points where he would need to wait for German flares to burn out before continuing. As he began his approach, Tommy's mind was completely focused on the technical challenges that lay ahead. The cave system he intended to navigate was partially flooded, and he had no way of knowing whether recent rains had raised water levels to the point where key passages might be impassable. His improvised breathing apparatus, constructed from a gas mask canister and rubber tubing, would give him perhaps 10 minutes of air underwater, but only if the flooding was limited to short sections of tunnel. The first phase of his movement went exactly according to plan. The drainage ditch provided perfect concealment, and German flare patterns were predictable enough to allow him to time his advances with precision. Tommy reached the base of the ridge at 0347 hours, approximately 2 minutes ahead of his planned schedule. The spring emerged from the limestone face through a natural opening that was roughly 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, partially concealed by fallen rocks and overgrown vegetation. The water flowing from the spring was crystal clear and surprisingly warm, indicating that it originated from deep underground sources that maintained constant temperature year-round. Tommy tested the current and found it to be moderate but manageable, suggesting that the underground stream system was substantial enough to provide reliable navigation routes. The mineral taste of the water confirmed his geological analysis. This was definitely limestone karst water that had been flowing through extensive cave systems for centuries. Tommy's entry into the cave system required him to submerge completely and follow the underwater passage for approximately 30 meters before reaching the first air-filled chamber. His improvised breathing apparatus functioned perfectly, providing enough supplemental air to make the passage safely while carrying his 40-pound demolition kit. The chamber he emerged into was larger than he had expected, with a cathedral-like ceiling that disappeared into darkness above his waterproof flashlight beam. The underground navigation that followed was a masterpiece of applied geology and mining expertise. Tommy followed the main watercourse through a series of interconnected chambers and passages, using his understanding of limestone cave formation to predict the path of the underground stream. Each junction was carefully mapped in his waterproof notebook, creating a detailed route guide that would be crucial for his return journey after placing the explosive charges. The first charge placement point was located in a narrow passage approximately 200 meters from the cave entrance, directly beneath the easternmost German gun position. Tommy had calculated that this position corresponded to a critical support pillar that bore significant structural load for the overlying rock mass. The charge itself consisted of 6 pounds of TNT wrapped in waterproof material and equipped with a timer mechanism that he had improvised from alarm clock components and blasting caps. The placement of the first charge required Tommy to work in a space barely wide enough for his shoulders, using his mining experience to identify the exact point where the explosive would have maximum structural impact. The limestone at this location showed the characteristic stress fractures that indicated it was under significant load, confirming his geological analysis. The timer was set for a delay of 8 hours and 45 minutes, calculated to coordinate with the timing of the subsequent charges. The second and third charges were positioned in a large chamber that extended directly beneath the central German gun positions. This chamber showed clear evidence of the quarrying activity that the Germans had conducted during construction of their bunkers, with fresh limestone debris scattered across the cave floor and blast marks on the walls where they had removed rock for their fortifications. Tommy realized that the German engineers had unknowingly weakened the very foundations of their own positions by excavating material from the supporting cave structure. These charges were larger, 8 pounds each, and positioned to target the natural limestone columns that provided crucial support for the overlying gun emplacements. Tommy's mining experience had taught him to recognize the load-bearing characteristics of different rock formations, and he could see that these columns were already stressed to near their failure point by the weight of the German concrete bunkers above. The time delays for these charges were set at 8 hours and 52 minutes, and 8 hours and 55 minutes respectively. The fourth and fifth charges presented the most technically challenging placements, requiring Tommy to navigate through a section of cave system that was partially flooded and extremely narrow. The passages in this area showed evidence of recent water erosion, suggesting that the underground stream had carved new routes through the limestone in response to changes in surface drainage caused by the war's destruction above ground. Tommy had to use his full mining expertise to safely traverse these passages while carrying explosive charges and timing equipment. These critical charges were positioned beneath the natural arch formation that provided primary structural support for the western section of the German ridge. Tommy's geological analysis had identified this arch as the key to the entire collapse sequence. Once it failed, the progressive failure would propagate through the limestone formation with devastating effect. The charges were 10 pounds and 12 pounds respectively, the largest in his entire operation, and their timing was set for 9 hours and 2 minutes, and 9 hours and 8 minutes. The final 2 charges were placed in positions that Tommy had identified as stress concentration points where the natural limestone formation met the artificial excavations created by German construction activities. These locations would serve to complete the progressive failure sequence and ensure that the structural collapse encompassed all 5 German gun positions. Each charge was 6 pounds, timed for 9 hours and 15 minutes, and 9 hours and 22 minutes. The entire charge placement operation took Tommy 4 hours and 18 minutes to complete, during which time he navigated over 800 meters of underground cave passages, worked in spaces that ranged from cathedral-like chambers to crawlways barely wide enough for a human body, and demonstrated mastery of geological principles that most mining engineers spent decades learning. His improvised timing system functioned flawlessly, with each charge equipped with redundant detonation mechanisms to ensure that mechanical failure could not compromise the operation. Tommy's return journey to the cave entrance was complicated by rising water levels, as autumn rains had begun falling during the night and were increasing the flow rate of the underground stream. Several passages that had been easily navigable during his inward journey were now partially flooded, requiring him to use his emergency breathing apparatus to traverse underwater sections. His mining experience with flooded mine workings proved invaluable, as he was able to find alternative routes through the cave system when his primary path became impassable. He emerged from the spring at 0847 hours, exactly on schedule according to his operational timeline. The German artillery positions showed no signs of activity or alarm, confirming that his underground operation had proceeded without detection by enemy observers. The autumn rain was now falling steadily, providing additional concealment for his return journey to American lines while also ensuring that the underground water levels would continue to rise, potentially complicating any German investigation of the cave system. The final phase of Tommy's return to American positions required him to traverse the same drainage ditch route he had used for his approach, but now in broad daylight with increased risk of German observation. His timing had been calculated to take advantage of a shift change in German observation posts that intelligence reports had identified as occurring every morning at 0900 hours. The 10-minute window of reduced German vigilance provided just enough time for him to complete his movement without detection. When Tommy finally reached the safety of American lines at 0934 hours, he was exhausted, soaked to the skin, and covered in limestone dust and cave mud, but he carried with him the knowledge that 7 carefully placed explosive charges were ticking away beneath the seemingly impregnable German positions. In exactly 7 hours and 38 minutes, those charges would begin a sequence of detonations that would demonstrate the power of applied geology to achieve what conventional military force had been unable to accomplish. The explosion sequence began at precisely 1630 hours with a deep, rumbling detonation that seemed to emanate from the very bowels of the earth itself. The first charge, positioned beneath the easternmost German gun position, created a localized collapse that was barely visible from the American observation posts but sent shock waves propagating through the limestone formation like ripples through water. The German gun crew at that position felt their bunker shake violently, but initial assessment suggested only minor structural damage from what appeared to be a delayed action artillery round that had somehow penetrated their position. 7 minutes later, the second and third charges detonated in rapid succession, their explosions amplified by the structural damage already created by the first blast. The combined effect was immediately apparent as a section of the ridge face began to sag and crack, sending streams of limestone debris cascading down the steep slope. The sound was unlike anything the soldiers on either side had ever experienced, not the sharp crack of conventional explosives, but a deep, grinding roar as millions of tons of rock began to shift and settle under the influence of gravitational forces that had been held in check for geological ages. German observers in the church bell tower of Morges reported the first signs of structural failure at 1638 hours, but their reports were initially dismissed by artillery commanders who could not understand how underground explosions could affect positions that had been carved directly into solid bedrock. The German engineering philosophy had always emphasized the security of positions built into natural rock formations, and the possibility that those formations themselves might be vulnerable to attack had simply never been considered. The fourth charge detonated at 1,642 hours, targeting the natural limestone arch that provided crucial support for the central gun positions. The explosion occurred at the precise moment when stress fractures from the previous blasts had propagated through the rock formation and concentrated maximum load on the arch structure. The effect was immediately catastrophic. The entire central section of the ridge dropped approximately 6 feet as the arch collapsed, taking 2 German gun emplacements with it into a newly created sinkhole that extended deep into the limestone formation. The German artillery crews at the remaining positions now faced a terrifying reality as their supposedly impregnable fortress literally disintegrated beneath their feet. The carefully constructed bunkers that had withstood weeks of American artillery bombardment were powerless against the geological forces that Tommy's charges had unleashed. Concrete and steel reinforcements that could deflect direct hits from 155mm shells were crushed like eggshells as millions of tons of limestone settled into new configurations determined by fundamental laws of physics and geology. The fifth charge explosion at 1,648 hours completed the destruction of the western gun positions as the progressive failure sequence reached its climax. The sound was now audible for miles in every direction, a continuous rumbling crescendo as the entire ridge structure rearranged itself according to the new stress patterns created by Tommy's precisely calculated demolitions. Clouds of limestone dust rose hundreds of feet into the air, creating a man-made thunderstorm that obscured the entire ridge from observation. American forward observers, watching through field glasses from concealed positions in the valley, reported scenes of complete chaos in the German positions. Artillery pieces that had dominated the battlefield for weeks disappeared into newly created chasms, their crews either killed instantly by the collapse or forced to abandon their positions and flee down the reverse slope of the ridge. The mathematical precision of the destruction was evident even through the clouds of dust and debris. Every German gun position had been eliminated, while the surrounding areas remained structurally intact. The final 2 charges, detonating at 1655 and 1,702 hours respectively, served to complete the geological transformation of the ridge and ensure that no German positions could be re-established in the affected area. These explosions triggered additional rock falls and landslides that buried any remaining equipment and created terrain features that would require months of engineering work to clear. The ridge that had been an impregnable fortress at 1,630 hours was by 1710 hours a landscape of rubble and newly formed canyons that bore no resemblance to its previous configuration. The immediate tactical effects of Tommy's operation extended far beyond the simple elimination of 5 German artillery pieces. The destruction of the ridge positions created a gap in German defensive lines that allowed American forces to advance rapidly toward objectives that had been inaccessible for weeks. More importantly, the psychological impact on German forces throughout the sector was devastating. If positions carved into solid rock could be destroyed by seemingly impossible means, then no defensive position could be considered truly secure. German intelligence officers spent days trying to understand how the ridge collapse had been achieved, eventually concluding that the Americans must have employed some form of secret weapon or experimental explosive. The possibility that a single soldier with mining expertise and 40 pounds of conventional explosives could accomplish such destruction was simply beyond their comprehension. This intelligence failure would have strategic implications as German forces throughout the region began to question the security of their rock-based defensive positions. The American advance that followed Tommy's operation proceeded with unprecedented speed and minimal casualties. The gap created by the ridge collapse allowed 3 full battalions to advance past German defensive lines and establish positions that threatened the entire enemy sector. Within 6 hours of the final explosion, American forces had advanced over 2 miles and captured strategic high ground that commanded German supply routes and communication lines. The armored counteroffensive that had been planned for the following day was cancelled as German forces retreated to avoid encirclement. Colonel Matthews, who had initially been skeptical of Tommy's unconventional approach, was among the first American officers to survey the results of the operation. His report to division headquarters described the destruction as beyond anything achievable through conventional military means, and recommended immediate investigation of similar geological vulnerabilities in other German defensive positions. The tactical intelligence gathered from this operation would eventually lead to the development of new American doctrine for unconventional demolitions in geological environments. The human cost of the ridge collapse was significant but concentrated entirely on German forces. Intelligence estimates suggested that approximately 60 German artillery crews and support personnel had been killed or wounded in the collapse, while American casualties for the entire operation consisted only of minor cuts and bruises sustained by Tommy during his cave navigation. This casualty ratio of roughly 60-1 represented perhaps the most effective single-soldier operation in the history of modern warfare. But beyond the immediate tactical and strategic results, Tommy's operation had demonstrated something far more significant about the nature of warfare itself, that understanding and exploiting natural systems could achieve results that raw firepower could never accomplish. The 5 German artillery pieces that had withstood weeks of conventional bombardment had been eliminated in 10 minutes by a coal miner who understood how limestone formations responded to carefully applied stress. It was a lesson that would influence military thinking for decades to come. The recognition that followed Tommy's unprecedented achievement reflected both the magnitude of his accomplishment and the Army's struggle to understand exactly what he had achieved. Within hours of the ridge collapse, reports were flowing up the chain of command describing the elimination of 5 enemy artillery positions through means that defied conventional military explanation. By the time accurate accounts reached division headquarters, Tommy Kowalski had become the subject of intensive investigation by both intelligence officers and combat engineers who needed to understand whether his techniques could be replicated elsewhere. The Medal of Honor recommendation came within 48 hours, supported by detailed testimony from every officer who had witnessed the operation's results. The citation would eventually read, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations involving an armed enemy of the United States. Private First Class Kowalski, demonstrating complete disregard for his personal safety and employing innovative tactics based on his civilian mining expertise, single-handedly eliminated 5 enemy artillery positions that had resisted all conventional attacks, thereby saving countless American lives and enabling a decisive tactical breakthrough." But Tommy's reaction to the sudden attention was characteristically modest. When Colonel Matthews personally presented him with the medal in a ceremony attended by war correspondents and senior officers, Tommy's acceptance speech lasted less than 30 seconds and focused entirely on thanking his fellow soldiers for their support and expressing hope that the war would end soon. He refused numerous requests for interviews and consistently deflected credit for the operation's success to what he called basic mining knowledge that any Pennsylvania coal miner would possess. The technical aspects of Tommy's innovation were quickly incorporated into Army Corps of Engineers doctrine, with specialized teams trained in geological analysis and unconventional demolitions. The techniques he had developed were applied successfully in similar terrain throughout the European theater, with engineer units achieving remarkable results against German cave-based defensive positions in the Siegfried Line and other fortified areas. The Army's newfound understanding of geological vulnerabilities would eventually be credited with saving thousands of American lives in the final months of the European War. Tommy's post-war life reflected his fundamental character. He returned to Carbondale, Pennsylvania, married his childhood sweetheart Mary Kowalski, a distant cousin who shared his surname, and resumed work in the anthracite mines as if nothing extraordinary had ever happened. He rarely spoke about his military service, even to close family members, and consistently refused attempts by military historians and journalists to document his wartime experiences. When pressed, he would only say that he had done his job like everyone else, and that the real heroes were the men who hadn't come home. The mining techniques that Tommy continued to develop in civilian life built upon the geological understanding he had refined during his military service. His innovations in coal extraction and mine safety were eventually adopted throughout the Pennsylvania anthracite region, contributing to a 30% increase in productivity and a significant reduction in mining accidents. The Kowalski method of progressive geological analysis became standard practice in mines throughout the eastern United States, though few miners understood its origins in wartime demolitions. Tommy worked in the mines until his retirement in 1975, having spent over 40 years underground and having trained 3 generations of miners in techniques that combined traditional knowledge with geological principles he had first applied on a battlefield in France. His reputation in the mining community was legendary, but it was based on his civilian achievements rather than his military service. Most of his colleagues had no idea that the quiet man who could predict cave-ins and locate rich coal seams with uncanny accuracy had once destroyed 5 enemy artillery positions with techniques that revolutionized military engineering. The recognition of Tommy's military contribution came primarily after his death in 1987 at the age of 67. A massive heart attack claimed him while he was working in his garden behind the modest house in Carbondale where he had lived his entire adult life. The funeral was attended by hundreds of miners, local officials, and family members, but also by a delegation of Army Corps of Engineers officers who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects to the man whose innovations had become fundamental to modern military doctrine. The memorial established at the site of Tommy's achievement in France was dedicated in 1994, 50 years after the operation that had changed the course of a battle and influenced the development of unconventional warfare techniques. The monument, built from Pennsylvania limestone in honor of Tommy's mining heritage, stands at the base of what was once the German Ridge, now a peaceful valley where the geological forces he unleashed have created a new landscape of gentle hills and small lakes. French and American veterans gather there annually to commemorate not just Tommy's specific achievement, but the broader principle that individual knowledge and creativity can triumph over overwhelming military odds. Modern military academies now teach the Kowalski Doctrine as a case study in how specialized civilian expertise can be adapted for military applications. Combat engineering courses at West Point, Fort Belvoir, and other service schools include detailed analysis of geological vulnerabilities and unconventional demolitions techniques that trace their origins directly to a Pennsylvania coal miner's understanding of limestone cave systems. The doctrine emphasizes that technological superiority and overwhelming firepower, while important, can sometimes be superseded by creative application of fundamental scientific principles. The broader lesson of Tommy's achievement extends beyond military applications to encompass questions about innovation, expertise, and the value of diverse perspectives in solving complex problems. His success demonstrated that solutions to seemingly impossible challenges often come from unexpected sources, requiring organizations to recognize and utilize knowledge that exists outside conventional boundaries. The ridge that had been impregnable to